What if everything you believed about your enemy was a lie? In the heart of World War II, hundreds of German soldiers, trained to see America as weak, divided, and decadent, were loaded onto a rattling freight train and sent deep into the rolling hills of Kentucky. They expected punishment, humiliation, maybe even cruelty. Instead, what they found in the American heartland would shatter every myth they'd been taught about the United States. Imagine stepping off a train after weeks of uncertainty, only to be greeted not by barbed wire and brutality, but by the golden fields of Kentucky, the scent of tobacco and fresh earth in the air. These German prisoners of war, hardened by battle and propaganda, were about to witness a side of America that no one back home could have imagined. A place where even enemies were treated with dignity, where the strength of a nation wasn't measured by fear, but by generosity and resilience. This is the untold story of how rural America, far from the front lines, became the stage for a quiet revolution, one that would transform not just the lives of these prisoners, but the very way they saw the world. What happened in those Kentucky fields would echo across continents, challenging everything the Nazis had claimed about American weakness. And as you'll see, the real power of the United States wasn't in its weapons or its armies, but in the everyday decency of its people. Stay with us as we uncover the hidden history of German POWs in Kentucky and discover how the American spirit changed the course of lives and maybe even the future of Europe itself. As the train slowed to a halt in the Kentucky countryside, the German prisoners pressed their faces to the tiny slits in the boxcars, expecting to see the harsh reality of enemy territory. Instead, they were greeted by endless fields, sturdy wooden fences, and the unmistakable calm of rural America. For men who had been told that the United States was a land of chaos and weakness, the peaceful order of Kentucky was the first shock. Stepping onto American soil, the prisoners braced themselves for hostility. They had heard stories of brutal camps, of guards eager for revenge, but what they found was something entirely different. American soldiers, many of them just farm boys in uniform, gave clear but respectful orders. There was no shouting, no violence, just a quiet efficiency that spoke volumes about American discipline. The camp itself, known as Camp Greenwich, was nothing like the prisoners had imagined. Instead of squalor, they found clean barracks with real windows, sturdy roofs, and even heated mess halls. The first meal was a revelation: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie. For men who had survived on watery soup and stale crusts, it was a feast that seemed almost impossible. Some prisoners whispered that it must be a trick, a brief kindness before the real hardship began. But the surprises kept coming. Each day brought hearty breakfasts, strong coffee, and lunches that would make any American proud. The guards treated the prisoners with a kind of matter-of-fact decency, as if they were simply workers caught up in the wrong conflict. For the German soldiers, it was a confusing new reality, one that forced them to question everything they'd been told about the United States. In those first days, the myth of American weakness began to crumble. The prisoners saw a nation that was organized, generous, and unshakably confident. And as they settled into life in Kentucky, they couldn't help but wonder, if this was the enemy, what else had they been lied to about? The real America was nothing like the stories they'd heard, and the truth was only beginning to reveal itself. When the work assignments finally arrived, the German prisoners braced themselves for the worst. They'd been warned that American labor camps would be harsh, that the so-called land of opportunity was just a myth. But as trucks rolled through the Kentucky countryside, the reality was nothing like the propaganda. Instead of barbed wire and barking dogs, they found themselves surrounded by the rolling green fields and sunlit barns of America's agricultural heartland. The first stop was the Henderson family farm, a place that had been worked by the same hands for 5 generations. Samuel Henderson, the owner, was a weathered man with a quiet strength, his handshake firm and his words direct. He didn't see enemies, he saw workers, and he made it clear that as long as the men did their jobs, they would be treated fairly. "You work hard, I'll treat you fair. That's how we do things in Kentucky," he said, setting the tone for everything that followed. The labor was tough, tobacco harvesting under the hot Kentucky sun, hand-stained brown backs aching from lifting heavy stalks. But what stunned the prisoners wasn't the work itself. It was the way they were treated. Samuel worked right alongside them, showing them the ropes, sharing his water jug, and correcting mistakes with patience instead of anger. There was no shouting, no humiliation, just a sense of shared purpose that felt almost foreign to men raised on stories of American cruelty. Lunch breaks became moments of revelation. Samuel's wife, Martha, would bring out platters of fried chicken, fresh biscuits, and sweet tea so cold it made their teeth ache. She moved among the prisoners with the same care she showed her own family, refilling glasses and offering seconds. For the German soldiers, it was a level of kindness they hadn't experienced in years, not from their own officers, and certainly not from the regime they'd served. The shock of American hospitality was impossible to ignore. These weren't the soft or decadent people they'd been warned about. Instead, the prisoners saw a community built on hard work, mutual respect, and a quiet pride in doing things the right way. The myth of American weakness was being dismantled, one meal and one honest day's work at a time. As the days passed, the German POWs realized they weren't just laborers, they were witnesses to a different kind of strength. In the heart of Kentucky, they saw the real America, resilient, generous, and unafraid to treat even its enemies with dignity. And as they looked out over the endless fields, they began to understand that the true power of the United States wasn't in its weapons, but in the character of its people. For the German prisoners, mealtime on the Kentucky farms became a daily reminder that they were living in a world far removed from the one described by Nazi propaganda. Each lunch break was a revelation, a moment when the lines between enemy and neighbor blurred in the shade of a tobacco barn. The food itself was almost unbelievable: crispy fried chicken, fluffy biscuits, creamy coleslaw, and sweet tea poured over ice. These weren't rations meant to break spirits. They were the same meals served to American families, prepared with care and shared without hesitation. Martha Henderson, the farmer's wife, moved among the men with a gentle smile, refilling glasses and offering second helpings. Her kindness was disarming. One afternoon, a young prisoner named Otto finally asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. "Why do you feed us like this? We're your enemies." Martha paused, her hands wrapped around a pitcher of tea, and answered with a quiet strength that seemed to echo the values of the entire community. "My sons are fighting in Europe. I pray every night that someone shows them kindness. You're far from home just like they are. That doesn't make us friends, but it doesn't make you less than human either." Those words struck the prisoners harder than any guard's command. For men who had been taught that Americans were cold and vengeful, the simple act of being treated with dignity was both confusing and deeply moving. The meals became more than just food; they were a daily lesson in American values, a demonstration that strength could be measured in compassion as well as power. As the weeks passed, the German POWs began to look forward to these moments of shared humanity. The conversations grew more relaxed. The farmers asked about their families back in Germany, and the prisoners listened to stories of American sons fighting overseas, of crops lost to drought, of hopes for peace. The sense of community was undeniable, and it was built not on shared language or background, but on the universal experience of hardship and the desire for a better future. The myth of American cruelty was crumbling, replaced by a new understanding of what made the United States unique. Here, even in the midst of a global conflict, there was room for kindness, for respect, and for the belief that every person, enemy or not, deserved a seat at the table. For the German prisoners, breaking bread with their American hosts was more than a meal. It was the beginning of a transformation that would change the way they saw the world forever. As the days turned into weeks, the German prisoners began to see a side of America that no amount of propaganda could have prepared them for. The sheer scale of American agriculture was staggering. In Kentucky alone, they watched as family farms produced more tobacco, corn, and livestock than entire regions of Europe. Fields stretched to the horizon, dotted with herds of cattle and rows of crops so perfectly aligned they looked endless. The prisoners, many of whom had grown up in small towns or worked in factories back home, were stunned by the abundance and efficiency they witnessed every day. It wasn't just the land that impressed them, it was the way Americans worked it. The Henderson family, like so many others in Kentucky, ran their farm with a combination of tradition and innovation. They used machinery that was years ahead of anything the prisoners had seen in Germany. Tractors, harvesters, and irrigation systems moved with a precision that spoke to a nation obsessed with progress. Even the barns and storage facilities were built to maximize output, reflecting a level of organization that seemed almost impossible to outsiders. But the real shock came when the prisoners learned just how much America was producing beyond the fields. Newspapers in the camp library told stories of factories churning out trucks, airplanes, and ships at a pace that dwarfed anything in Europe. The United States was outproducing entire continents, fueling not just its own war effort but also supplying its allies. For the German POWs, it was a revelation. The so-called soft Americans were powering a global conflict with an industrial might that was simply unmatched. Conversations among the prisoners shifted. Men who had once mocked the idea of American strength now spoke in hushed tones about what they were seeing. "Back home, we were told Americans were divided, inefficient, too diverse to work together," one former factory worker admitted. "But here, even in the countryside, everything runs like clockwork. It's not weakness, it's a different kind of power." The myth of American inferiority was unraveling with every passing day. The German soldiers realized that the United States' true strength wasn't just in its military, but in its ability to feed, clothe, and equip millions, while still showing generosity to those who had come as enemies. In the heart of Kentucky, the prisoners saw firsthand how American productivity, innovation, and unity were reshaping the world. And as they worked the fields and read the headlines, they began to understand that the real story of America was one of resilience, abundance, and a relentless drive to build something better. As the seasons changed in Kentucky, so did the hearts and minds of the German prisoners. What began as suspicion and resentment slowly gave way to a sense of respect, even admiration for the American way of life. Every day spent working alongside American farmers, every conversation shared over a meal, chipped away at the old beliefs that had been drilled into them back home. The transformation was subtle at first, but soon impossible to ignore. It was the small moments that made the biggest impact. During breaks in the fields, the prisoners listened as Samuel Henderson and his neighbors talked about their own experiences in the previous great conflict, about sons fighting overseas and about the hardships their families faced. There was no boasting, no need to prove superiority, just honest stories of struggle and hope. The Americans didn't hide their losses or their pain, but they also didn't let bitterness define them. Instead, they focused on rebuilding, on helping each other, and on treating even their former enemies with a basic decency that was both humbling and inspiring. One afternoon, a local logger named Jacob Morrison shared coffee and stories with the prisoners as they worked in the woods. He spoke of fighting in France during the First World Conflict, of being wounded and spending time in a field hospital alongside men from both sides. "Hate is easy," Jacob said, his voice steady, "but it doesn't fix anything. Around here we know you're just soldiers, same as our boys. We don't have to agree with your leaders to see your humanity." For the German POWs, these words were a revelation. They had been taught that Americans would never see them as anything but enemies, yet here they were, being treated as men first and combatants second. The change was visible in the way the prisoners carried themselves. The mocking jokes faded, replaced by thoughtful questions and genuine curiosity. They began to ask about American customs, about the history of Kentucky, about the future that might be possible after the conflict ended. Some even started to pick up English, eager to communicate more deeply with the people around them. The barriers of language and ideology were slowly being replaced by a shared sense of humanity. For many of the German soldiers, this was the first time they had ever questioned the stories they'd been told about the United States. The myth of American weakness had been shattered, replaced by a new understanding of strength, one rooted in compassion, resilience, and a quiet confidence that didn't need to shout to be heard. In the fields and forests of Kentucky, the prisoners discovered that true power wasn't about domination but about the ability to forgive, to rebuild, and to see the best in others, even those who had once been called enemies. As winter settled over Kentucky, the German prisoners braced themselves for the cold and for the loneliness that always seemed to come with the holidays. But what happened that December would become one of the most unforgettable chapters of their time in America, a moment that revealed the true heart of the United States, even in the midst of global conflict. The camp's commander, Colonel Robert Barnes, made a decision that surprised everyone. The German POWs would be allowed to celebrate Christmas. Local churches and families from Henderson and nearby towns rallied together, donating decorations, handmade ornaments, and even small gifts for the men who, just months before, had been considered the enemy. The mess hall was transformed with evergreen branches and twinkling lights, and the kitchen staff prepared a feast that rivaled any American holiday table: roasted turkey, glazed ham, mashed potatoes, and an array of pies that filled the air with the scent of cinnamon and apples. But it was the personal touches that left the deepest mark. Each prisoner received a package carefully assembled by local families. Inside were simple but meaningful items: hand-knitted scarves, writing paper, pencils, bars of soap, and decks of cards. Every package included a handwritten note, often from a mother or a child, wishing the recipient peace and comfort during the season. One note tucked into a blue and gray scarf read, "To the German soldier, Merry Christmas from the Wilson family. Our son James is somewhere in Europe and we hope someone is showing him kindness this season. May you find peace in your heart and may this conflict end soon so all our boys can come home." For the German prisoners, these gestures were almost impossible to comprehend. They had expected to be forgotten or worse, to be reminded of their status as outsiders. Instead, they were welcomed into the American tradition of generosity and goodwill. The emotional impact was overwhelming. Some men wept openly, others sat in stunned silence, clutching their gifts and reading the notes over and over. The idea that American families with sons fighting against Germany, would take the time to show such kindness was a revelation. The Christmas celebration became a turning point. It wasn't just about the food or the gifts, it was about the message behind them. The United States, even in wartime, refused to abandon its values. The spirit of community, the belief in second chances, and the willingness to see the humanity in every person, these were the qualities that set America apart. For the German POWs, that Christmas in Kentucky was more than a holiday. It was proof that the real strength of the United States lay not in its weapons but in the hearts of its people. And as the snow fell softly outside the barracks, the prisoners realized they would carry this lesson with them for the rest of their lives. As the conflict in Europe dragged toward its conclusion, the German prisoners at Camp Greenwich found themselves living through a moment in history that would leave a permanent mark on their lives. News of the Allied advance filtered into the camp through American newspapers and radio broadcasts. The headlines told of battles in France, the liberation of cities, and the slow but steady collapse of the regime the prisoners had once served. For many, these reports brought a confusing mix of relief, sorrow, and uncertainty about what the future would hold. But even as the world outside changed, life in Kentucky continued with a sense of purpose and routine. The American guards and local farmers made it clear that the end of the conflict would not change the way the prisoners were treated. Samuel Henderson, whose farm had become a second home to many of the POWs, summed it up best: "The work goes on and so does respect. You're still welcome here no matter what the headlines say." This simple promise of continuity and dignity was a powerful reminder of the American commitment to fairness and decency, even in times of upheaval. When the official announcement of Germany's surrender came in May 1945, the camp was filled with a heavy silence. Some prisoners wept openly, mourning lost family and a homeland in ruins. Others sat quietly, trying to process the end of a cause they had once believed in so fiercely. Yet through it all, the Americans around them offered steady support. There were no celebrations of victory at the prisoners' expense, only quiet understanding and a focus on the future. In the months that followed, the German POWs remained in Kentucky as arrangements were made for their return home. During this time, the bonds between the prisoners and the local community grew even stronger. The Henderson family invited the men to Sunday dinners, and local churches welcomed them to services. The prisoners, once seen as outsiders, were now part of the fabric of rural American life. They learned about American traditions, shared their own stories, and began to imagine what life might look like after the conflict. For many of the German soldiers, the lessons learned in Kentucky would shape the rest of their lives. They had arrived expecting cruelty and found compassion. They had been taught to see Americans as weak, only to discover a nation built on resilience, unity, and a deep sense of justice. The experience forced them to question everything they had believed about the United States and about themselves. As the time for repatriation approached, the prisoners knew they would never forget what they had witnessed in America. The kindness, the productivity, the unwavering commitment to human dignity, these were the true strengths of the United States. And as they prepared to return to a devastated Germany, they carried with them not just memories, but a new understanding of what was possible when a nation chose hope over hatred and decency over division. When the time finally came for the German prisoners to leave Kentucky, the world they returned to was almost unrecognizable. Germany was a nation in ruins, its cities shattered, its people struggling to survive in the aftermath of total war. Yet the men who stepped off the ships and trains back in Europe carried something rare and powerful, a first-hand experience of the United States that defied every stereotype and shattered every myth they had once believed. The legacy of their time in Kentucky was more than just memories of good meals and fair treatment. It was a living lesson in the strength of American democracy, the power of community, and the enduring value of human dignity. These former prisoners became unexpected ambassadors, sharing stories of American generosity and resilience with friends, family, and neighbors who had only known the United States through the lens of wartime propaganda. They spoke of the Henderson family's kindness, of Christmas gifts from strangers, of working side by side with Americans who had every reason to hate them but chose instead to offer respect. Rumors and reports began to circulate across post-war Germany about the miracle of American POW camps. Some speculated that these experiences played a quiet but crucial role in Germany's eventual embrace of democracy and its reintegration into the global community. Historians now point to the thousands of former POWs who returned home with a new perspective, men who had seen the real America, not the caricature painted by their former leaders. They understood that the United States' true power wasn't just in its military might, but in its ability to build, to forgive, and to inspire. The story of Kentucky's fields became a symbol of what was possible when a nation chose to lead by example. The productivity and abundance the prisoners witnessed on American farms stood in stark contrast to the shortages and rationing they had known in Europe. The sense of community, the willingness to help even those who had once been enemies, offered a blueprint for rebuilding a fractured society. For many, the lessons learned in the heart of the United States became the foundation for a new way of thinking about strength, justice, and the future. Even decades later, the impact of these experiences could be felt. Letters crossed the Atlantic for years, connecting former prisoners with the American families who had changed their lives. Some returned to visit, standing once again in the Kentucky fields where their old beliefs had been uprooted and replaced with hope. The legacy of Camp Greenidge and similar camps across the United States was not just a footnote in history, it was a testament to the quiet power of American values, and a reminder that sometimes the most profound victories are won not on the battlefield, but in the simple acts of kindness that echo across generations. The story of German prisoners in Kentucky is more than just a historical curiosity. It's a powerful reminder of what truly sets the United States apart. In a time when the world was torn apart by hatred and suspicion, the quiet fields of rural America became the unlikely stage for a transformation that would ripple far beyond the borders of Kentucky. Here, in the heart of the USA, the values of fairness, generosity, and respect for human dignity were not just ideals, they were lived out every single day, even toward those who had once been called the enemy. What happened in those Kentucky fields was nothing short of extraordinary. German soldiers, raised on a steady diet of propaganda, arrived expecting cruelty and humiliation. Instead, they found themselves welcomed into a community that believed in second chances and the power of decency. They worked the land alongside American farmers, shared meals with families who had every reason to be bitter, and experienced firsthand the abundance and productivity that defined the American way of life. The myth of American weakness was shattered, replaced by a new understanding of strength, one rooted not in domination, but in compassion and resilience. The legacy of these experiences didn't end when the prisoners boarded ships back to Europe. The lessons they carried home, about democracy, about community, about the possibility of reconciliation, helped lay the groundwork for a new era in post-war Germany. The simple acts of kindness shown by American families became stories told around dinner tables, in letters, and in the rebuilding of lives and nations. The true power of the United States, as revealed in the tobacco fields and small towns of Kentucky, was its unwavering commitment to treating every person with dignity, no matter the circumstances. As we reflect on this untold chapter of American history, it's worth asking, what would the world look like if more nations chose to lead with decency, even in the darkest of times? The story of Camp Greenwich and the German POWs is a testament to the idea that real strength is measured not by the ability to conquer, but by the courage to show compassion. It's a lesson as relevant today as it was in the 1940s, a reminder that the American spirit at its best is defined by hope, generosity, and the belief that even the smallest acts of humanity can change the course of history. If this story surprised you or made you see the United States in a new light, share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from America's past and check out the next video for another incredible journey through history. Until next time, remember, the real power of the USA has always been its people and the decency they choose even when the world is watching.